So let's explore the built-in Django Forms support. For this, let's add a new file in our app folder, so in the reviews folder, and let's name it forms.py. The name is up to you, and you technically don't have to generate a new file, but that is a common pattern to do so. Now, in this file, we're going to create a class that defines the shape of our form and the different inputs we want and the validation rules for those inputs. And we'll then be able to automatically render that form in a template and to automatically let Django validate that form for us. So for this, we create a new class here, and the name is up to you in general. I will name it review form, and it's kind of a convention that it ends with form, but technically that's not required. Now, what is important and what is required to utilize Django's form features is that we do extend the built-in form class Django ships with. For that, we import from Django, so just from Django, no sub module, we import forms like this. And then here we extend forms.form with our review form here, like this. Now, in this class, which we're building here, we can define the different form fields we want to have. Now, that's kind of similar to the model fields we had before in the earlier modules related to defining a model. But now with this form class, we're not defining any database model. This will not have any impact on the database like this. Instead, we're just defining the shape of a form with the different input fields it might offer. And some of these fields will be very similar to model fields, as you will see, but some model fields will also not be available as form fields. But in general, a high similarity makes sense because very often you will want to fetch data for a model with help of a form. So it makes sense that there are some similarities, as you will see. But let's see it, and therefore let's create or let's recreate this form which we had here with our custom form class. So for this, in the review form, we can define a user underscore name field, for example, and this name is up to you. And now set this equal to forms.char field, for example. And again, that's the similarity to the models. There we had models.char field, if you recall, and that would create a text field in the model and in the database. Now we have forms.char field, and that will not have any impact on the database, but it will later create a text input field in the form which we're going to render. So we can add such a char field like this, and in its simplest form, we can leave it like this and have this basic form which we're defining here. Now let's go to our views.py file and get a hold of that form there. So therefore we can import from .forms, so from this forms file in this folder, we can import this review form class which we defined there. And now here in our review view, I will change how we render this. I will comment out this post part for the moment, and instead, below that, before we return the rendered result, I will create a new form variable, though that variable name is also up to you, and instantiate a review form like this without passing any data to it. So the constructor here stays empty. This argument list stays empty. I don't pass any data to the constructor. I instantiate it like this. And then when we render the template, instead of passing has error here, which we won't need anymore, I pass a key named form. This key name is also up to you. And I point at the form stored in this form variable. So I pass this created form through the form key here to my template. And now in the template, we can replace the label and the input, not the whole form, just the label and the inputs we might have there, with form being output like this. So with this form variable, which we're setting here, which holds our form, just being output like this. And this will render a couple of inputs and their labels automatically based on the form definition in our class. Now we can and now should also get rid of this if check here, and we should still keep our CSRF token. So that's how our form should look like now. A form element with our action and method, the CSRF token, then the form controls in the end, which will be rendered here, and then our button. Of course, we could switch the order here, but typically you want to have the button after the controls. Now with that, if we save this, if I go back to localhost 8000, I have this form, which looks very similar to the form from before. But this actually was now automatically rendered by Django based on our form class. And if we inspect it here, we see that indeed it is a different form. The input, for example, has the required attribute. The name is now user underscore name. Before, for our own form, it was username in one word. And the label is also user whitespace name, not your name as we had it before. And the ID also is a different one. So this is definitely not the HTML content we wrote before, but it's automatically generated HTML content by Django. And that's of course very convenient, because now we don't have to write all those controls, which can be very cumbersome for longer forms, but we can rely on Django for it to output this form to us. But even better than that, we can also use Django's built-in validation. Back in Views.py, we can comment this request method equals post check back in, and now we don't have to extract data manually anymore. We can get rid of that. We don't have to validate data manually anymore. Instead, we now can also create our form here. And now set this equal to review form, as I did it down there. But here in this post block, we can pass request.post to the review form constructor. And keep in mind, post was that collected data, which is part of the post request. Now that data will be the data the user entered in the form. So now we're passing that entered data into review form. And what this allows us to do now is it allows us to call form.isValid, a method which exists on this form class because it's a method defined in this form class we're inheriting from. So we can call isValid now, and isValid will do three things for us. It will go ahead and validate the inputs, and for example, by default, it requires them all to be required. It requires them to not be empty. So it will check whether what the user entered for a username is not empty. Then, if the form as a whole is valid, it will return true here. Otherwise, it will return false. And last but not least, if the data is valid, it will populate another field with that valid data. So here, if form is valid, then I want to print form.cleaned data, which is the field that will contain that cleaned validated data automatically. So that's another field which exists on the form, just like isValid exists, because we're inheriting from the form provided by Django. And then I redirect. If we don't make it into this if block, we would recreate the form and re-render the template. So let's see this in action. If I save that, if I reload this page, if I enter nothing here, I now automatically get this error actually, because of this required attribute, which tells the browser to already pre-validate our inputs. That's nice to have to avoid that the invalid form is being submitted, but you shouldn't rely on just that, because in the developer tools, I can, for example, delete required, as I did it here, and now I can submit the empty form. But then you see we again end up on this form page because we do render that if we don't make it into this isValid block. That's where we would redirect, but we don't make it in there if the form is not valid. And this server-side validation is nothing we could circumvent on the client. If I do enter something valid here though, then I make it to the thank you page. And then here in the console, we see this dictionary, which is being output here. And that's this cleaned data, which is a dictionary with the keys, which are our field names in the form class, and then the values entered by the user. And then we could use that data to submit it to a database, write it to a file, or do whatever we want to do. So that's how we can use the built-in form object. But we can do even more with it. For example, we can conveniently show error messages in the form here if we submit it in an invalid state.